I blame my parents for this, but we weren't allowed to watch television as a child. So, as when I was a child, so I have a really low ability to interpret non-written texts, I think. So I've never been really that interested in filmic kind of representations, mainly because I very easily get bored with them and I can't seem to make myself focus on them for any length of time. Whereas give me a printed document and I'm good to go. But yeah, lots of people that I work with do work in different fields, and I think there's lots of opportunities. Anyone who works in any kind of popular culture will obviously be much more engaged with audio and visual things, but I myself haven't worked a lot on them, though I do have a secret expertise on puberty blues as both the TV series and the film. That was one of the very few things that I've ever really written on that was a non-written text. The court material is quite recent for me. I guess I've moved into court documents in the last few years. And I particularly work with trials around sexual assault, and they're complicated materials because on one hand you get this extraordinary volume of material and quite explicit discussions that go on in the trial, like some of it can be quite confronting to read. And on the other hand, they're quite flattened documents. You know, you don't get the sense of someone's body language, for example, in a document around a court trial, which you would get if you looked at a film version of it, a recording. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in how we have these texts that are quite voluminous in most cases for the court trials I work on, but at the same time they only tell you part of the story. You don't get someone's accent. You don't always know, for example, if they're an Indigenous victim or not. There's a whole range of things you can't always tell from the page, but there's much you can tell too. So it's a place where you get the voice of perhaps the victim or the complainant, as they're technically called, or you get the voice sometimes even of the accused talking, you know, explaining what happened. You get the voice of the judge and what he's telling you about the context of the trial. So yeah, it can be quite exciting. And at the same time, you know you're not getting the full picture as you would if you were in the actual courtroom.
For my honours thesis, I did use a lot of advertising materials. So images and texts from the 60s through the 80s. That was, and it's a few oral histories that I was able to collect in Indonesia. I was able to go to Indonesia with the help of an interpreter to talk to these women who participate in this tradition called jamu, which was the herbal medicine, and they recounted to me their memories, their recollections of their tradition during the 60s and 80s, and then I was able to record that and quote it verbatim in my thesis. I think oral media seems more what's the kind of word? What am I trying to say here? Like more kind of nebulous. That's not really the word I'm aiming for, but you know, it when you see something written down, it's there, it's concrete. Like I can kind of go back to it and I can kind of engage in it. I can highlight. I can write around it. Whereas orally, it's more like you hear it and then it's gone. I watch all my TVs and movies with subtitles on, so I'm about words, really. I feel more engaged with words, and especially even the difference between on a screen and print. I think there's a difference for me there as well.
And I guess as an intellectual historian, you know, that means that primarily I'm based on texts, and by texts I mean printed sources. I don't tend to do myself up close readings in archives because I'm interested in telling big stories. So I want to tell stories about the history of the devil from ancient times to the present, or the history of life after death from ancient times to the present. And that means that I look for those primary sources and those major texts, or those major players in the field that have made a big difference to our contemporary or to the past understanding of some particular religious phenomenon. So a religious phenomenon like the afterlife or the devil, or I've just finished work on I guess it doesn't get bigger than that topic on God, a book on the history of God, where I'm really trying to look at the big themes, the big stories, the major texts, the major players, to really show the way in which an idea like God is historically inflected, it's culturally determined, it shifts around, it's inconsistent, it's incoherent, it's full of paradoxes and contradictions, and yet I try to show that, you know, that there's a pattern to the history of God that enables us to tell a coherent story in spite of that, from way back when to the present.
Images, visual storytelling has always been part of, say, newspaper journalism. Photojournalism is an integral part of telling stories in newspapers. And traditionally, and still, most journalism, those judgments are made on things we call news values. And that's what's important, what makes a good story. So when you make a decision about what to run and what not to run, there's a whole lot of judgments that go on at an editorial level about content, about audience, about impact, about ethics, legal ramifications as well. So making those decisions in the first instance is about what's the best way to tell the story visually, as well as to complement the text. And certainly broadcast journalism is totally driven by images, and television journalism specifically. But there's a whole lot of other judgments that get made about what goes up, and some of those are logistical, some of those are ethical, and some of those are about narrative.
I guess I kind of see it as more being a very similar approach. I feel like all these things, I always see these things as being produced or constructed for a very distinct purpose, which makes it conditioned necessarily, but there's always this sort of human intent behind it all. And so I think it doesn't really, I could be looking at an image in an art gallery, or I could be reading a biological, like a physiologist's lab report in the 19th century. And to me, it's in a way, it's kind of the same stuff. Like there's a person who's created something, and they've done it for a very distinct purpose, and you're seeing the result of that. And I think that might be a very simplistic way of looking at it, and I know it is simplistic. But I think I always kind of see the human person, like the human subject behind it all. And I think in that sense, these things all start to look really alike, and they're just different modes of producing something.
I think the thing for me is that works like Jacques Attali's Political Economy of Noise, where communities define themselves by the things they consider sound and the things they consider noise. Now that was brilliant, because as soon as you got that, you're away, you know. And so the stuff I did on mental health was very much around that notion of social and cultural and gendered exclusion on the basis of what was categorised as noise and what was categorised as rational sound. And so, you know, that, and then you get the spaces within which they work. And I think that also came back from the performance angle, because I was very cognizant of the fact that when you go into an acoustic to play, every acoustic is different. And you play to that acoustic if you're smart, you know. So that then gave us spaces and places. And for me, landscape was the other thing. I mean, I would go back to Scotland or go back to England, and I would see a sunrise in the middle of winter with the trees like sticks, and it just, it filled the soul in a way the Australian desert doesn't. I just am stunned at how much it just doesn't work for me. But you know, but then is it about familiarity? It probably is, you know. But again, I think we can't get past all those unconscious connections through sight and sound and feel of the places and spaces and sounds we live in. It's what makes us. I remember coming back to Australia, and I'd never had this, but I got off the plane and I could smell the eucalyptus. Now, interestingly, migrant experiences of ships talk about that. The ships come in to within a certain distance of the coast and they can smell the eucalyptus. Absolutely amazing. But I mean, for me, I guess having spent my life with hay fever in Australia, not in Scotland, but then I saw the pollen counts and it's easy. It's always wet and things grow very slowly. So in Scotland, you're all right. But yeah, so it's you know, that's I think the strange thing. We are just probably not cognizant of all the kind of things as sentient individuals that we take on board. And so that's where the history locked down as particular things, or musicology locked down as musical things, misses that.
I would say that I do deal primarily with text, but as a contemporary historian, obviously there's a lot more going on in the archives that I look at. So I guess it also depends in terms of, and this is all again a kind of what we could call like a transdisciplinary question as well, of like what is a text? What gets counted as a text is the question. So the archives that I look at are full of images often, but I'd read them as a text. So there's posters and leaflets, often say a leaflet, an anti-war leaflet that's got a napalmed child, a child who's had the US military's dropped a bomb on them, you know. So and these leaflets or posters are handed out, you know. But those leaflets will sit alongside meeting minutes and reports and other textual, if you want to talk about text in a very, you know, as in like words on a piece of paper. But these images interact. The images are scattered throughout the archives that I look at, social movement archives of anti-war groups, women's liberation groups. There's no clear distinction for these groups between images and text, I think. A lot of the time, images have a really powerful place in these movements because images are how you communicate politically with people. There's an attempt to use images to convey a point that the text maybe can't convey. You know, stop the war in Vietnam, you know, like that's all well and good. Some people might be convinced by that, but there's a hope that by showing the mutilated child that this will provide more of a more powerful sort of message.
The visual criminology, so understanding how, for example, the importance of showing images of victims in domestic violence cases in court, how that becomes almost more important than the victim's testimony. So having the visual image of a battered woman in court has a more important and lasting effect in the outcome of the trial, the argument has been made, than the testimony at the time. First of all, the timing of when trials take place. So trials are not kind of immediate, speedy things that happen, you know, as soon as someone is battered, they're in court the next day. So wounds have healed, you know, things have changed in the person's life. And so, but the other reality about testimony in court is that it's a nerve-wracking process, and people never quite come across as probably as they wish they could. You've got a defense lawyer in your face, you know, asking you questions or whatever that might affect the way you come across. However, a still image of what happened to you following the event is a striking, kind of example of what, the kind of pain and torture and suffering that you went through. So that would be the argument in terms of the difference in outcome.
One of the sort of downsides about the difference between image and text is I feel like sometimes people will look at an image and it takes 1 second and they think, okay, I've got that. Whereas a text, you have to take time to read it, and so I think people are sometimes dismissive of images for that reason, because you can look at something very quickly, but it takes sustained looking to really understand things, I think. Whenever you're reading art, there's always an issue of translation, because you're going from this visual language and trying to explain and analyse it through verbal and written and spoken language. So that process of translation is always there. Even if I was looking at a painting that was made in my context by my community, there's still that aspect of translation, which is important. But I think many aspects of the way that you look at literature are in common with art. Again, considering the context in which something was made, other types of literature that surrounded it, similarly types of art that surround that artwork. I find so many times I have looked at an artwork as an image on Google, and I get some sort of idea about what the scale is, and then I see the object itself and I'm often quite shocked by it's much smaller, much bigger than what I imagined. So having that sort of personal interaction with the object itself is really important, especially in understanding how it's used. The difference between I've seen prints that are the size of a thumbnail versus altarpieces, so actually having that interaction is really important to understand the object. And also signs of use for the prints made for private individuals, when you know, the figure of a saint is almost rubbed away because of the devotion of an individual towards the image. That's important. And the way that it's folded, you can get a sense of fold lines and things like that, which you can't get on the internet. So I remember attending, I think it was St. Anthony's Basilica, and seeing the site of, you know, where he was buried, and people over hundreds of years have touched this same place for, you know, for blessing, for healing, and just seeing the stone just completely worn away. It's quite emotive, you know, to see the faith of so many people in that one place.